Don't be afraid. Coffee is brewing. We'll have a fresh pot for you shortly. Just recap, some of you heard last week, but I'll tell you again that our youth group went on a youth retreat, and God moved in a really great way there. 5 of our teens received Jesus as their Savior. Great, yeah. 2 rededicated their life to Christ. Also, last Sunday, one of a college student also gave his life to Jesus at the end of church. So God's doing some really great things at the Commonplace, and I'm excited to be a part of that. The youth group is going to take over the service in 2 weeks, so I'm sure we'll be hearing about their retreat and what God's doing there. So make sure that you don't skip whatever, the 28th, I think, something like that. So come on out to that for sure. So as I mentioned earlier, we often build our church schedule around the college schedule because it's just an easy way to mark the calendar year for us. And we graduated a bunch of students last week, and there was the actual graduation yesterday. So church attendance will be a little bit less as we say goodbye to some of our students over the summer, but we get to also just kind of catch our breath and move into a new pace for the summer while we get ready for the fall as well. And so I just want to take a Sunday. This is an unusual kind of a sermon. I wouldn't even necessarily call it a sermon. More of a, let's talk about what's next, right? Let's figure this out together. Where do we go from here? So the Commonplace Church is 10 years old. The coffee shop is 10 years old. I've been a pastor in Lock Haven for 13 years. And so we've got a pretty long legacy in our community. And we've, over the last year, God has done some interesting things in our church and has spoken to us in some clear ways. I kind of like to think about these as 3 streams that are kind of merging into one river. And what we want to discern is, where is that river taking us? And that's going to be our goal this summer, is to make a clear plan, a strategic plan for the future of the Commonplace. And so I'm not here to tell you what that plan is, because that needs to come from the Lord and from the body working together. But I will tell you where He's spoken so far. So a little over a year ago, we did something called Natural Church Development Survey, in which we did a church-wide survey of about 30 people, and we evaluated how healthy is the Commonplace. Kind of like going to the doctor for a checkup. And it turns out, by God's grace, we're quite healthy. There was a lot of energy and unity in the church, as well as, just a sense of family. And the area that we had the most growth in, I think if you go to the next slide, Ian, was something called need-oriented evangelism. All right? Need-oriented evangelism. So we had a team of people who decided, it was our job to take this idea. Those are 3 important words, by the way. Evangelism, let's work backwards. Evangelism is sharing the gospel message with people who don't know Jesus. And one of the ways that we do that is by meeting physical needs and spiritual needs in the community. And so we realized that we didn't really have a plan for how we did that, other than having church in a coffee shop every Sunday. And so what we did as a first step was we began to look at focus groups, and we talked to our children in our children's ministry and asked them questions like, what would it look like for your friends at school to come to church? And we gathered information from them. We talked to our youth group. We talked to college students. We talked to adults. We even surveyed visitors, some of those who have just kind of first-time attenders. What was your experience at the Commonplace? Were we welcoming? What could we do differently? And so we gathered 3 pages of information, which you're welcome to look at if you'd like. And some of the key areas that emerged from that of how we could do a better job of need-oriented evangelism was refining our first impressions. That's like from the moment you come to the Commonplace, what your experience is. Actually, even before then, if you're looking for a church on the internet, how does our webpage come across to you? Obviously, space issues emerged. Sometimes families said, listen, it was nice to come here, but I had a hard time finding a seat for my family. being educated on how to share your faith. Sure, we agree that we ought to share our faith, but some of us don't know how we should do that very well. Discovering and meeting physical needs in the community. It's not that we don't want to, but oftentimes we just don't know what the needs are, let alone how to address them. And also the willingness to get out of our comfort zone. So what we did is we gathered all this information, but we haven't taken next steps on this. And I was thinking about a verse in James chapter 1, 23 to 24. It's not a funny verse, it's an important verse. It says, if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. And so we have taken as a church the brave step of stepping into you ever go to a changing room that's got mirrors at all the angles and you start to see yourself from positions you've never seen yourself and it's a little bit frightening, right? Like we're used to looking at ourselves this way, but all of a sudden you get a sideways view and you're like, oh my, you know? And when you survey a church, I'll be honest, as a pastor, I was nervous. Like, what's going to come out of this? And so we got a picture of ourselves. We got a snapshot of what we look like, but we haven't made next steps in doing anything with that. So that's important to us. We need to listen to what the Spirit is saying to our church, and we need to develop a plan about how can we reach our friends and neighbors with the message of Jesus. We ran the diagnostic test, but now we've actually got to make some changes. So that's one of the streams that God has moved our church in, is this area of need-oriented evangelism. How do we go about this? All right, so we've gathered information. One of the reasons why we pushed pause on next steps for that area was that God moved in our church in a way that we began to go through a process called Healing the Heart of Your Church, in which we were researching our church history, and we're fresh out of that, so I won't go into all of the details on what took place. But as we gathered stories and confessed sins in our church past, we began to listen to what God was saying to us. And God spoke clearly to our church through that experience, and we felt the need to continue living out the call. This is kind of what we walked away with from that experience, was to reach the lost, hurting, and marginalized in our community. Boy, that sounds an awful lot like what he spoke to us earlier last year, right, about need-oriented evangelism. It's funny, when God starts to speak, it all starts to sound the same. And we walked away from that with some qualities, not just a mission, but as we go about that mission, what are some qualities that God is calling us to live out? These are from you. This is what you responded as a body to that endeavor. It was things like, well, we've got to be a church that is loving. We've got to be bold. We need to be compassionate. We need to be creative and resourceful. That's an important one. We need to be in tune with the Spirit, which explains in a little bit. I'm going to give us some next steps, and this is an important part of that. We never want to move where God's Spirit is not moving. That's just exhausting, all right? Trying to force our plans on God never works well. We need to be prepared for an awakening, right? And I think that's happening. Like 6 people coming to know Jesus in the last week or two at the Commonplace is an amazing thing. I think God's stirring and doing stuff in our body, and I think that's important. And so this is just a confirmation of the conversation God started with us a year ago about need-oriented evangelism. I don't know if you remember this. It was probably a year or two ago. I preached a sermon on this idea of how our prayers gain the most traction and see the most results when we pray as Jesus is praying for us. So the Bible tells us that the Holy Spirit prays on our behalf. Sometimes we don't know what to say, and the Spirit prays just with groans, and reflects our soul to the Father. We also know from the Bible that Jesus is in heaven interceding for us. So to the Father. So we have the Trinity, the God who created us and loves us, prays for us. And he's praying something for the Commonplace right now. He's got dreams and hopes for us. And as we get our prayers in line with his prayers, that's when we begin to see fruitfulness result. And so that's my hope for our church, is that we would get our prayers our vision in line with the prayers and the vision of Jesus for our church. So that was stream 2. Stream 1, natural church development, this idea of our need-oriented evangelism. Stream 2, healing the heart of our church, what's God calling us to in this area of reaching the lost, hurting, and marginalized in our community. Stream 3 is a stream that's been working for about 4 or 5 years in the church, and some of you have served on something called the Transformation Team. The Transformation Team was a team organized to meet the future physical building space needs of the church as we outgrow the coffee shop. We have been trying to do this for over 4 years. In fact, I looked through my records that I keep as a pastor, mostly emails, and I identified that it was almost 4 year ago, this time of year, that we made a purchase offer on a building downtown. And the idea then was to get rid of the coffee shop or to move the coffee shop to a bigger space that would accommodate more people. And God shut the door on that. Eventually that building burned down, which was a hard no. And so we recognized that for 4 years we have been trying to move, and God has continually shut doors on us. It's frustrating to me as a pastor because I know that God's mission for our community hasn't changed. Like, He still wants the lost and the hurting and the marginalized to come to Jesus. But where are we supposed to put them, right? And so I feel this tension inside of me, and I've often wondered why God is so slow to respond in this area. To be honest with you, when we finished the Healing the Heart of Your Church process, when we confessed some sins in our church story and got right with God, I was really hoping that, I wasn't going to get a phone call that week. Hey, Pastor, I've got a beautiful building to give to you. That didn't happen, right? Instead, what God gave us was a fresh vision for lost and hurting people. It would seem as though God's more concerned about people than He is about buildings. I don't know why that is, but maybe because buildings don't go to heaven. So I want to say on the front end of this section of this river that I don't know what the space answer looks like. I recognize that we need to make changes, but I don't know what the answer is. But Jesus does, and I'm going to trust His plan for us. So about 2 months ago, the church board asked an important question, and it was basically this. If God is saying no to what we've been asking for 4 years, maybe we're asking the wrong question. So up to this point, our idea has been we ought to get a bigger space and just all go there together, right? And that doesn't seem to be what Jesus has moved us into. So what would it look like to explore alternative ideas? Having church in a coffee shop 10 years ago was an unusual idea. I remember at the time I was still working for Woodlands Bank as a bank teller, and I was driving with my boss, Bob Force, and he said, I was explaining this idea to him, and it was probably crazy, and he said to me, well, what do you think is like success for you? And I said to him, boy, I'd love to have a church with 70 people at it. Like, to me, at that moment, at 23, that was a win. If I could somehow convince 70 people to come to church at a coffee shop, that would be wonderful, right? And we met that. I had no idea what to do after that. But we need to make a plan. So back then, we had this bold, crazy idea of church in a coffee shop. Maybe it's time to think of other bold, crazy ideas. Maybe it's time to think like a missionary again. All right, not to impose our understanding of what church should look like in terms of building and structure, but rather to ask God to show us. Maybe it's time to plant another expression. I want to do whatever Jesus wants us to do. We need to be unconventional risk takers, being creative and resourceful and in tune with God's Spirit. One of the things that God impressed on me as your pastor this last year was a passage in Matthew 9, 35 to 38. Many of you have read this over and over again. I've read it before. Let me just read it for us here. It says, and Jesus went throughout all of the cities and the villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and healing every disease and every affliction. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly for the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest field." And that, for some reason, struck me in a way I'd not thought of before. That when Jesus views a community, he doesn't see a meager harvest. What Jesus says to his disciples in this passage is there are a lot of souls out there ripe for my kingdom. Like they are ready to be harvested in. And the limiting factor in this is there's just not enough people to go out and engage them. Jesus doesn't say the harvest is plentiful and we just don't have a big enough barn to put it in, right? That's not what he says. He doesn't say if you build a great big barn, then the harvest is going to come in on its own. He says we need to be engaged and active in the harvest process. So we need to look to the harvest, not worry about the barn. In this analogy, the church building is the barn, all right? So when Jesus says, well, he's calling us to invest in people, and I believe he'll provide the space. You know, for the last, I would say, 50 years of church planting in America, of what it looked like to start a church, the idea was often like a Field of Dreams. Did you ever watch Field of Dreams? If you build it, they will come, right? And so if we built gorgeous buildings that had wonderful programs and were just fantastic, you know, met all of your needs, then people would just naturally come to them because they were a lot of fun. Kind of like if you wanted to start a grocery store. All you need to do is have quality products at a lower price and the shoppers will come to you. But the change has happened in our society that it's no longer advantageous or even desirable to go to church. So for many years, if you wanted to be well respected in the community, whether you believed in Jesus or not, you might have gone to church just because it was the culturally appropriate thing to do. If you were a new mom in a community and you wanted to make friends, you may believe in God, you might not be in love with him, but you're going to go to church just because it's a great place to make new friends and you'll look good to your peer group. And so it was more built into American culture to go to church, whether or not you really were committed to Christ. And so in that era, if you wanted to start a church, you just kind of built a great one, and then people came to you. And I'm speaking in general terms here, all right? However, there's been a shift now, all right? It is no longer cool to go to church. Maybe some of you have been a Christian for a while, and you've recognized this, that there was a time when being a Christian brought some sort of respect. That's not really the case anymore. Barna research now says that people like the general idea of pastors in America is that they're nice people but don't need to be listened to. That makes my job very difficult. And so what this means, though, this doesn't mean like the death of Christianity in America. It just means we've got to be thinking differently about how we do church in America. All right? In fact, I think we might become a healthier church as a result of this. And so what I think is important is that we do. Let me back up. I'm not saying that churches with lots of programs or great ministries are not relevant. God has done many things through them. We are a church that has ministries. We have a children's ministry taking place right now, and God is doing good things in our children's ministry. We have a youth ministry. So don't walk away from this thinking our pastor doesn't like ministries. That's not the case at all. If anything, we need to be even more creative in our ministries that we do. But what I think Jesus is saying to us is that as we do this hard work of thinking like a missionary and looking at our neighborhood like a missionary does, that the expression of what church looks like might not be our conventional model. And the reason I say this is because it hasn't been our story up to this point. Having church in a coffee shop is unconventional. And because every time we've tried to move in that direction, he has consistently said not yet or no. Again, I don't know what his plans are. It could be that tomorrow I get a phone call from somebody who says, I've got a great church building for you. I'd love just to give it to you. And in that case, I'll say, Jesus, what are you saying to us through this? But it would seem if, as the leaders of your church, as we listen to God's Spirit, it would seem that He has consistently told us to be a little more creative. And so I think what Jesus is saying to us is that we need to look, is that the harvest will lead to the barn. Does that make sense? The harvest will lead to the barn. So we can dream and conjure up all kinds of visions of what we would like for our future. Believe me, I have done this myself, right? As a pastor, often my vision of success is to look at other churches that are bigger than mine and to try to be them, all right? Because there's not a whole lot for me to pin my identity on as a pastor, other than, boy, if I could have all that they have, then I will be a good pastor. What Jesus is saying is that's not necessarily the mark of a win for our church. Maybe we need to think differently about what church looks like for us. I don't necessarily know what that looks like, but here's what I want us to do as a church. I want us to approach this idea of building and space with open hands. Because up to this point, as a pastor, I have kind of come to him with closed hands, in the sense that I had some ideas of what I wanted it to look like, but I've just decided that's a miserable way to approach Jesus. And so I'm going to come to him with open hands and ask him to speak into our church what it is he's asking us to do. We feel, as church leaders, that there's alignment coming. These three streams are coming together in one direction that's going to lead our church into a fruitful and exciting future. I think that's what God has for us. So, here's what I want us to do. We're going to, rather than running three streams all at the same time, we're going to reorganize to bring some alignment to this. And what I want us to do, and I'm going to invite you into, and the elders are asking you to join us in this, is a couple of steps. Number one, I want to invite you to make the future of our church a matter of significant prayer. These are exciting times. And I want to just challenge all of us for the next month to set aside one meal, one day of each week to fast and pray. Now, if you're in a position where, for health reasons, you can't fast, maybe God would ask you to set aside a night of entertainment. You normally watch TV for an hour, set aside that hour and just bring the commonplace to God in prayer. In Daniel, there's a fascinating story of Daniel has a vision, and he doesn't quite understand what it means. And so he fasts and prays until God brings clarity to the vision. And I kind of feel like that's the story of the commonplace. God has given us a vision. He's given us some pieces here. And I want to invite us together as a body to fast and pray so that we can discern how those pieces come together. So, I know fasting is no fun. If it was fun, we'd all be doing it all the time, right? But I'm going to ask this. Think about fasting and prayer is like putting gasoline on your prayer life. It kind of turbocharges it. It declares to God that you are serious about what it is you're praying for. You also, in some small way, enter into the sufferings of Jesus in this when we deny ourselves something for his mission in our lives. Another time that we can see in the Bible that fasting and prayer was used is in the book of Acts. And the early church was discerning where to go next. And so they fasted and prayed, and out of that, God put a calling, and they commissioned leaders, Paul and Barnabas, to go out to new places and to take the gospel there. And so my prayer is that out of our fasting as a church, God would do these two things. He would bring clarity to the vision, and then he would call and commission new workers for his harvest. So here's some specifics. As you do this, so what I would encourage you to do is to pick a meal. For me, Sarah and I are going to fast on Tuesdays at lunchtime. And so during the time that I would normally be eating, I'm going to stop and I'm going to pray. I'm not going to talk to God the whole time. I'm going to spend some of that time just being quiet. Maybe I'll listen to some worship music. I'm just going to listen to what God might say in that time. Maybe he'll give me a thought or a verse or an idea, and if I do, I'm going to write that down, because that seems important. Maybe he won't say anything. I'll just enjoy being in his presence. And then I'm going to begin to pray for our community in that time, because that's the thing I do know he's calling us to, is our neighbors. So I'm going to pray for our neighbors. I'm going to pray for our city. Maybe we should divide it up into sections. And each week pray for a different section. It just came to me. I should have written it down. But anyway, that's the idea here, is that we would pray for our neighborhood, pray for our schools. Maybe we'd pray for our government. pray for our local government. We pray for just demographic populations, our college students. And then as you pray, spend some time listening and seeing if Jesus speaks into that. Take note of what he says, because that's important in this process as we take a creative approach. And then on Wednesday, June 5th, we're going to hold a church-wide gathering for prayer and worship. So we'll reserve the back room. If that's too full, we'll go upstairs or something. We'll find more space. And the goal of this is not necessarily to create a plan. That comes later. But together, we would worship Jesus, pray for our community, and listen to what he might be calling us to. I'm excited about this night. We're going to have communion today. And we're going to have communion on this Wednesday. So we're going to kind of sandwich this month of prayer in between two moments of communion as we celebrate what Christ has done for us and we kind of get our hearts in line with what he's doing. And then the following week, June 13th, we will hold a strategic meeting to begin the process of planning. So we're going to listen, we're going to worship, and then my prayer is out of a place of hearing from Jesus, he will begin to organize us around a plan of engagement on mission. And I think that's going to look like strategies on how to reach the lost. I think that's going to involve places and buildings on how we go about doing church. But it all comes out of a place of surrender and listening to the voice of God. So that's my goal for the church. You are invited to all of these things. I invite you to come to this month of prayer, to this night of worship, as well as to the strategic planning meeting on Thursday, June 13th. I want to invite our worship team to come on up. And we have some communion stewards who are going to hand out communion to us today. What I would invite you to do is to, as they hand out the bread and the juice, just hold on to both of those things until everybody has been served. Maybe you'll just spend some time, even right now, just quietly listening to what God's voice is saying. And then I will come and lead us into communion as a church body after that.